Alright, well welcome to the second podcast on fungi. This will cover objectives 2, 3, and 4. In this podcast, we're going to talk about some basic features of fungi. We're going to talk about where they evolved from or what they evolved from, and then we'll talk about their ecological significance. Let's begin by drawing a phylogenetic tree. We've learned before that bacteria came off first, then archaea, and then we had eukarya come off. And eukarya, we know, now exists in 3 kingdoms, plus the protists, and the protists are divided up into multiple kingdoms that you don't need to worry and you don't need to learn about. So we're going to put them here because they are eukaryote. Then the plants, and then the fungi, and then at the tip here are the animals. Fungi, since they share a common ancestor with animals, more recently than they shared a common ancestor with plants, we would say that fungi are more closely related to animals than plants. So fungi, closer to animals than plants. Fungi evolved about 1,500 million years ago. We know that the ancestor to the fungi was a eukaryotic flagellated ancestor. A unique feature of a fungal cell, I'm going to draw a fungal cell here, is that it has a cell wall which is much different than we see in plants, protists, archaea, or bacteria. And it's a cell wall that's made of a polysaccharide called chitin. We sometimes see chitin structures in animals. So most likely is a adaptation that formed before the fungi and the animals branched apart. Let's talk a little bit about how fungi get their nutrition. They are heterotrophs, which means they have to eat organic material for their carbon source. They cannot build large carbon structures using CO2. So they are heterotrophs. Now, if we were to draw a yeast cell, a fungal cell, in fact, why don't we make a distinction real quick here? A single-celled fungus is called a yeast cell. Funguses can also be multi-celled organisms, and in this case we call them filaments. They may form structures that look something like this, multicellular in nature. Now, let's look at the single-celled yeast here. The same example could be drawn with the multi-celled filaments, but it's just a little easier to draw here. We don't see a mouth on this yeast cell, so they can't consume the organic material like you or I would. Rather, well, let's actually draw an organic material here. Let's say there's this large polysaccharide here, which the yeast cell cannot digest. However, the yeast cell, what it will do is secrete an enzyme, and for space I'm just going to put E-N-Z, but that's an enzyme, and this enzyme will break apart this large structure here into much smaller sugars. These smaller sugars now can be directly taken up into the cell, absorbed into the cell. So this is how the yeast cell is going to get its material, by breaking up these structures using an enzyme and then absorbing those smaller structures. Okay, let's now talk about how these large fungal multicellular organisms can grow. And for this, I'm going to draw a mushroom-like fungus. And there's a few features on this fungus we should point out. We have spores, or rather there's a lot of spores that make up this fungal body here. And these spores can be released. These spores turn out to be haploid and very similar to a sperm or an egg. So these spores are used for reproduction, and funguses can either reproduce sexually or asexually using these spores. Within this large structure here, we have tubules that branch off in many different directions, and they're all interconnected. And they will form these large mats down here of the same kind of tubules. These are called, well actually let's draw these up here. These are called hyphae. These single tubules are called hyphae. And what they do is they allow for growth of the fungus, and they absorb nutrients. That's the two functions of the hyphae. These large mats of a collection of hyphae we call mycelium. Now I'm going to draw a blown up picture of these hyphae to make another definition for you. So these hyphae can either be something like this, where they have nuclei spread all over and floating in a single cytoplasm. Alternatively, these hyphae will still have the nuclei, but in a more structured way, separated from each other using these structures that we call septae. These septae divide the individual nuclei from each other. So we have either septated hyphae or non-septated hyphae. Now, next I'm going to talk about the ecological significances of fungi. And the first thing I want to show on this drawing here, because it makes it a little easier to see, I think. So the first way that they have a large ecological significance is that fungi are excellent decomposers. This is incredibly important for the ecosystem because they will absorb nutrients from dead organisms. So that gets rid of those organisms, but it also recycles nutrients. The nutrients that were once found in those organisms that have died now can be recycled through the fungi and then into other organisms that might eat the fungi. And I show that on this slide here because you can see how these hyphae are extending in multiple directions, and they can move towards these dead and decaying organisms. Okay, so ecological significances of fungi. The first thing we just talked about, but let's go put it on the list just so we have it, is that they are excellent decomposers. Second is that they are parasites or pathogens. We know approximately 30% of all fungi are parasites or pathogens. Each year, between 30 to 50% of all fruit product is destroyed by fungi. So let's step away from the whiteboard and look at these two pictures of corn smut and ergo that's found on rye. All right, so here we see the two examples I'm going to talk to you about. This corn smut, this is a fungal species that grows on the corn, these very large structures, and it damages the corn to such an extent that the corn cannot be eaten. This is very damaging to these crops and to the financial well-being of the farmers who are growing them and to the people who eat it. In addition, I want to talk about this ergot. This is found on rye plants. In addition to destroying these plants here, they also produce a toxin that when humans ingest it, it will make them very sick. In fact, around 40,000 people died in the Middle Ages because of this ergot infection. Interestingly enough, this ergot contains the raw material that is used to make LSD. Let's talk about fungi as mutualism. And first, let's talk about their role as their mutualistic roles with plants. So if we have some grass growing here, and we have an organism that eats this grass. I'm not even going to try to make this look like a real organism, except to give it some legs, a body, and a head. Now it's going to try to eat this grass, and usually it's going to eat it, and that's good for these plant-eating organisms. However, almost every plant, perhaps every plant, has microbes and bacteria or fungi associated with them. And what sometimes can happen is that these fungi can be associated with these plants or these grasses, and they produce a toxin that when this plant-eating animal eats the grass, it makes them sick. And so over time, these plant-eating organisms avoid these grasses. They have to find something else to eat. So this is a mutualistic relationship where the fungi receives nutrients from the plant, and then it pays that favor back by keeping the cows or whatever these animals are from eating the grass. For the last two examples, I want to move to the PowerPoint slide to talk about them. Okay, let's talk about the relationship, the mutualistic relationship between these ants and fungi. These ants cannot digest the plants themselves, but what they can do is they take these leaves back to their nest. And their nest contains, so I just put plus, contains large amounts of fungi. The fungi do a couple things. One is they produce chemicals that detoxifies the plants, because these leaves also carry with them various toxins. But the really cool thing that they do is that they will begin to break this down. So they feed on the plant. As they're feeding on the plant, let's just try to draw it over here, their hyphae begin to grow because they're looking for the plants and they're feeding on the plants. They get stronger and they grow. And it turns out that the tips of these hyphae are very rich in nutrients. So the ants now, they still can't eat the leaves, but they eat the tips of these hyphae. Doesn't kill the fungus, but they get enough nutrients from these tips to survive. So it's a mutualistic relationship because the ants bring the leaves back to their nest so that the funguses can eat them. As a result, the fungi grow to such a point where the ants now can eat some of the funguses. In addition, humans also benefit from the use of fungi. So we know that yeast are very important in producing cheese, bread, alcohol, either for consumption or biofuels. And also we can grow large amounts in these large fermenters of various kinds of drugs. So we use these funguses in our daily lives quite effectively. All right, that ends this podcast. If you have any questions for us, please let us know. Bye.